Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Shevuot Daf Yud Bet. Today's stuff is dedicated to the release of Idan Alexander after 584 days in captivity, wishing him a refuah shlema and praying for the safe release of the rest of the hostages as quickly as possible. Okay, we're going to get started with a quick review. We saw already on Yud Amud Bet, this halach of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said that Tamidim, if we have these extra animals that were designated for the Korban Tamid, they would basically be redeemed, right? Tamimim, okay, which is a unique exception that we allow them. Normally, you have to wait till they are blemished before you can redeem them. That's what Rabbi Yochanan said. Then we brought a difficulty from our Mishnah because we said, right, according to our Mishnah, wait, let me just remember if there was something else we need to say before that. Right. Then we explained what's the whole reason why this works. It works because leiv beitim ma'neh, because the court already stipulates ahead of time that whatever doesn't get used for this will be able to use for something else. Okay, which by the way is the topic of Daf Mishalahem this week, all about kind of taking something and repurposing, like a donation or something like that, and some halachic issues that relate to some practical ramifications of this halacha. I'll also mention that Alana Steinhain's Shiur went up last week, but then the sound was bad. She redid it. It went up again yesterday. So if you didn't get to listen to it, or if you listened to it and struggled, you can listen again. And now it's back up, which is the topic of her Shiur is what's so bad about Tuma, which is like an interesting, we've been discussing for a long time now from the beginning of this chapter, this Masechet, all about impurity and all these sacrifices that are brought about impurity. So worthwhile listen to hear what Alana has to say about it. We're now going to continue. We have, again, this halach of Rabbi Yochanan, leibiti manalehem. But then we said that Rabbi Shimon, second, just want to find it in the Gemara, right, leibiti manalehem, and then, right, Rabbi Shimon, sorry, just lost my train of thought for a minute. Right. So now we just had this difficulty on, right. Okay. Now remember where we were up to. We had a difficulty. We ended with this difficulty from our Mishnah. This doesn't really fit with our Mishnah, this lei beitim analehem, because the whole thing about taking a seir that was used for one thing and using it for another thing, remember, and Rabbi Shimon, right, and they said, but the rabbi said to Rabbi Shimon, how could you use, you think you could use the seir for Rosh Chodesh and bring it on the holiday, or this year for the holiday and use it on Rosh Chodesh, or the one for Yom Kippur that was done outside. You think you could just, if one was left over because you used it for something else, which is kind of the same idea of the extra korbanot, you can just swap their use. Now, remember, Rabbi Shimon thinks that each year was used for a different purpose. So they said, how could you use one for the other? So he answers them, it's because they all belong to one general category of Tumat Mikdash v'Kodashav. The Gemara said, why didn't he just say leiv beitim manalehem? That would have been a much easier answer of saying, oh, well, they're all some same general topic when he said each one, though, is a specific thing within that general topic. He should have said leiv beitim manah, to which the Gemara answers, oh, Rabbi Edi Rabin said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore this explains Rabbi Yochanan's position, right, which is all based on leiv beitim manalehem, that this is not Rabbi Shimon's position. Okay? Rabbi Shimon doesn't agree with what Rabbi Yochanan said. Rabbi Yochanan said what he said about taking these animals and redeeming them when they're still unblemished. And let's just read from the last few lines of Yud Aleph Amud Bet. Tmidim shelo hutzrechu letzibor ledivrei Rabbi Shimon ein nifdim tmimim. If you have, okay, just like the seir, he wouldn't have allowed it unless they're the same general topic. But therefore, if you have a korban tamid that's left over from last year, you can't redeem it, okay? Unless it has a blemish, you have to wait till it gets blemished to be able to redeem it. And Rabbanan Hukim, right? The divrei chachamim niftim tmimim. That's basically where we ended. The Gemara ended with this question. Basically, this concept that chachamim allow this, and it's only the chachamim's position, not Rabbi Shimon. Now they want to know, Rabbanan depligale Rabbi Shimon maninu. And that's Rabbi Shimon we see in the Mishnah. Because Rabbi Shimon didn't say le beitim manalehem. He had to come up with some other answers. So it's clear he doesn't think you could do this. But where in a Mishnah or a braita do we see that the rabbis have this position? That's what we want to know. Because we started with Rabbi Yochanan saying, Tzmidim that the tzibur doesn't need anymore, the leftover ones can be sacrificed, can be redeemed when they're tmimim. Again, what do? You redeem them, you purchase them, even while they're unblemished. That removes the sanctity. Then you take the money from the new year and you buy them back, and then you use them on the altar. But how are we allowed to do this? And where does it come up in any tannaitic source? So we're going to say, let's try a few options. In the end, we're not going to succeed. Maybe let's go to the motar ketoret. The motar ketoret we were able to redeem without, so to speak, waiting till it gets blemished. Well, that's because shani ketoret de lo bar re'ihi. You can't let the ketoret graze, the incense, let it graze until it gets a blemish. There's no such thing by ketoret. So ketoret, and we're going to say this then, maybe the rabbis held that when it comes to animals, since you can wait till it has a blemish, better to do that and only redeem them once they're blemished. But the ketoret doesn't have that possibility, so will allow you to redeem it directly without having to wait till it gets blemished. There is no such thing really as it getting blemished. Okay, so that doesn't work. And we're going to basically go back to all the sources we saw yesterday. Okay, maybe Ela Rabbanan de para. What did we see by the para aduma? There we had a tannaitic source, the braita that said you could redeem the para aduma if certain things happen to it. Even if you find a nicer one, you can just redeem it. So that seems to show that there is this option of redeeming animals when they are unblemished. No, dilmashani para didamea yikarim. As we said yesterday, maybe you can't learn from para to our case. And yesterday we used this for a different thing, but we said this aspect that it has something unique to it because it's so expensive. Because of the expense, perhaps the rabbis permitted us to redeem it when it's unblemished, but you can't necessarily learn from there that the rabbis say the same thing about these extra animals that were left over for the korban tamid. Ella Rabbananda Amrule. Let's go to the last source we saw yesterday. When the rabbi said to Rabbi Shimon, according to you, can you use one for the other? And they're really questioning him and saying, I don't see how you can. And Rabbi Shimon thinks you can. And then he has to explain himself why he thinks that. Well, if we assume there, now you have to assume one thing, which is what they're going to say is, if you wanted to use that source, you would have to say that the rabbis are Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, remember the positions in the Mishnah. There's Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is unique because Rabbi Meir says all the Seirim have the same, atone for the same sins. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon each thought that they atone for different things. So now if you say the rabbis hold by Rabbi Yehuda, and the purposes of these Sirei Chatat are different, okay? Now, let's read, I'm going to read it in the Gemara and see how you could read this Mishnah and how the Mishnah could theoretically support this position of the rabbis, assuming the rabbis in our Mishnah are Rabbi Yehuda. V'hachi ka'amar. This is what they said. Now, they don't exactly say these words, but remember they asked him, can you sacrifice one for the other? But the way the Gemara reads this question is, Bishlama ledidi, da'amina le beti manalehem. Because they want to put those words into the words of the rabbi. According to us, we can explain very easily Maushi Kravubas. The assumption is they're asking Rabbi Shimon because they're saying to you there's a question. To us, it's obvious. To us, it's obvious that if I have a seir that was dedicated for the holiday, and then the animal got lost, and I used a different animal, and now I find the lost animal, and now what do I do with it? It's obvious to us, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who has different uses for each of the seirim, right? Each one comes for a different purpose. It's still obvious that we can use one for the other because we hold le beti manalehem. We hold that any public sacrifice, when we designate the animal for public sacrifices, the Beit Din already makes a stipulation that if it's needed, great, it'll be for this use. But if not, we'll use it for something else. And that's why, according to us, because we hold by that, because remember, that's the whole thing. Rabbi Shimon doesn't hold by that. That's how we ended the daf yesterday. So if you say it's Rabbi Yehuda, who thinks the Sirim have different positions, different purposes, it doesn't matter because we hold le beti manalehem. And therefore, for us, it would be obvious, tuhachi, because of that, yikrivu. We think that if you have a seer left over from the holiday, of course you could use it for Rosh Chodesh because it's all, right? The rabbis made that stipulation from the beginning. Ela ledidach, but you, to amar lo, that you don't hold le beti manalehem, amay yikrivu. And that would be a perfect source for the rabbis. Then we'd say, there you see the rabbis hold le beti manalehem, and that all works fine. But who's to say that the rabbis in that is Rabbi Yehuda? Dilma Rabbi Meir. Maybe the rabbis there actually hold by Rabbi Meir's position, which is right that all the Sirim are all for the atone for the same sins. Well, then there's a different reason why it's obvious to them that you can use one for the other because they're all one and the same. They're all one category. This is what they said. And then this wouldn't be a source at all for the rabbis because this has nothing to do with le beti manalehim. This has to do with something else entirely. When the rabbis there get into a whole back and forth with Rabbi Shimon, what they're saying is this. And again, this is option 2. The point is, it's not clear from the Mishnah which way to read it. And since you could possibly read it this way, it doesn't prove that the rabbis hold le beti manalehim. For me, makes perfect sense. Again, the rabbis with Rabbi Meir's position makes perfect sense. All the Seirim come for the same purpose. If they're all for the same purpose, they atone for the same sins. Well, then it's basically the same sacrifice. Okay, one is called the Shiur on the Regel, and one is called Shiur on Rosh Chodesh. That's just because you bring it on a different day. But they're all the same, and therefore, that's why Mishum Hachi Yikravu. Of course, according to us, you can use, just interchange them. You designate it for that. It got lost. You found it after it was already atoned for. So yeah, use it for something else. But according to you, Rabbi Shimon, who thinks that there's a different purpose for every korban, how could you possibly switch one for the other? To which again, Rabbi Shimon responded, oh, it's because they're all one general topic and therefore they're interchangeable. But again, what do you see from here? You can't necessarily prove the rabbi's position that Rabbi Yochanan talked about, which is the rabbis hold you can redeem animals when they're unblemished. That certainly doesn't come out of here according to this interpretation. And therefore, we tried 3 sources, the 3 we saw yesterday that all had to do with our topic, and that would have been a perfect way to prove, but none of them can prove the Ketoret because there is no option of waiting till it gets blemished, the Paraduma because it's more expensive, and the Mishnah, our Mishnah, because it doesn't necessarily say anything about Le Bete Manale, and it could be for a completely different reason, because it could be Rabbi Meir. In which case, the Gemara concludes, when Rabbi Yochanan says that this is a debatable point between Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis, and the Rabbi Yochanan Gemara Gamrila, he had a tradition about this, and he learned by tradition that L'divrei Rabbi Shimon ein niftin, L'divrei Chachamim niftin. That according to Rabbi Shimon, you can't redeem them unblemished, and according to the rabbis, you can. So again, the big debate between Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis about what we do with these extra animals that were designated for Korban Tamid. Can they be redeemed as is, or do you have to wait until they get blemished? Or you can't redeem them. We're going to see. Maybe you don't have to wait till they get blemished, but the point is you can't redeem them when they're tamimim. So according to that, that is all a tradition that Rabbi Yochanan had. We can't find a source for it in the tannaitic material. So now the Gemara says you could find a source for Rabbi Shimon, right? That's what we kind of saw, because the fact that Rabbi Shimon in our Mishnah doesn't say that they can be, that the chatat could be just used one for the other without an issue, does seem to imply he doesn't hold that way, but we don't really have any source for the rabbis. Now we're going to ask, okay, so the Rabbi Shimon de le biti manalehem my avdilhu. So what do we do with them? If he doesn't think that this is all stipulated from the beginning, then what do we do with them? The assumption is we don't want to wait for all these animals to get blemished and redeem them. So what do we do with them? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, mikaitzim behen et hamizbeach. You might remember this term, kaitz hamizbeach. We learned a lot in Masechet Shkalim, because in Shkalim we talked, just like we quoted the Mishnah, Masechet Shkalim, about what to do with the extra Ketoret, right? Shkalim is all about the inner workings of the Beit HaMikdash and what they did with the Shkalim, with the money they collected and what they bought with it. And therefore, perfect place for this to come up, which is when you have extra sacrifices left over, what you generally do is you use them for kaitz hamizbeach. Kaitz is like a term almost for dessert. You want to keep the altar going. So you put out these extra, like you have the regular food that you eat and the regular sacrifices you bring, and then there's the dessert, the extra. So we bring these voluntary burnt offerings on the altar when the altar is not busy. And they would take all this extra money they had from, various things, whether it's extra money, whether it's, like, for example, all the extra money from last year that they don't know what to do with, Some of it is, I think, all of it, I don't remember exactly, but it's used for these extra sacrifices. So if you have these animals that were designated for a burnt offering, now it's the Tamid burnt offering, the one they brought every day, and they're left over at the end of the year, and you can't use them for the Tamid for next year because those have to be bought with next year's money. Now, according to the rabbis, it's very easy. Redeem them right now, buy them back, and then buy them back with the new money from this year. According to Rabbi Shimon, what you do is, according to what the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon says, Rabbi Yitzchak says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, according to Rabbi Shimon, you just put them on the altar and burn them as the voluntary burnt offerings. They were already a burnt offering, now you use them for a different burnt offering, and that you can do. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, however, Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak says, Umode Rabbi Shimon b'sirei chatat, she'em mekaitzim begufan ela b'demehem. However, he agrees that if you have extra tamidim because they were korbanot olah, you can just roll them over to voluntary korbanot olah. That's easy. It was an olah before, it can be an olah now, and you can do that. However, if you have, for example, the sirei chatat, the ones we've been talking about in our Mishnah, that are extra because, let's say, you lost one and then you designated a new one, brought the new one, and now this one is left over. You can't, now you use them for Ketz HaMizbech, but not directly. Okay, you have to wait till they get a blemish, redeem them, and take the money and buy korbanot olah. Right, that's the demehem with their money. The money from there, you buy a new animal. You don't use that same animal because what? You can't just roll it over because hachahu demi-ikara olah, v'hashta olah. The other case, it was first an olah, now it's an olah. Aval hatam demi-ikara chatat v'hashta olah. But this one was originally a sin offering, and now you want to change its designation. We don't allow that. Now, theoretically, we would. However, he says, Gezerah la'achar kapara atu lifnei kapara. The situation where we have here is, I lost the animal, I brought a different one in its stead, and now I have nothing to do with this animal. So theoretically, I could use it as a burnt offering. But the problem is, if we allow me to switch the olah to a chatat, to a sin offering, right? Again, we're talking communal burnt offering. Sorry, communal sin offering. We want to switch to a communal burnt offering. You can't do that. Even though theoretically you can, we're not going to allow you because of Xera. What are we worried? We're worried that if we allow you to do it in that situation where you already received atonement and there's nothing, right? You don't have anything to do with this animal. You might think that when you designate the animal earlier and you haven't yet you atoned, you designate this animal for the Shiur, for the chatat offering, and then you decide, oh, you know what? I want to use it instead for the burnt offering. You might think you could do that because you'll say, oh, I remember a different time we switched the chatat for the olah, and that can't be done before you got atonement for it. So we don't want anyone to get confused about that, and therefore we just say, can't switch a sin offering for a burnt offering so that you don't do it in a way that would be forbidden. Okay, that's the gzeira. So that's this halacha right now about Rabbi Shimon. We're focusing not so much on, okay, there's two things we said. Number one, that according to Rabbi Shimon, the extra ones, what do you do with them? You take them, you use them as these burnt offerings, the kayetz hamizbeach, extra offerings to just keep the altar active all the time, voluntary burnt offerings. But that's only burnt offering to burnt offering. If you want to take a sin offering, you can't just turn it to a burnt offering because of this gzera. And now we're going to have three rabbis who each are going to say, oh, I have a source for this, a tannaitic source for what we just said. Amar Abai, Afana Nami Tanini, each one is going to introduce, there's Abai, then Rava, then Ravina. They're each going to say, oh, I also have a tannaitic source like this, right? Afana Nami Tanina. I also have a tannaitic source to prove this. Par v'seir shel Yom Kippurim, okay, that's the bull offering and the seir, both of them are sin offerings that are brought, right? The par is for the Kohen Gadol and for the Kohanim, and the seir is for everyone else. That's the seir we've been talking about that goes inside. Sha'avdu, that got lost. V'frish acharim tachtehem, and once it got lost, they took another animal instead of them. V'chein sirei avodah zarah, there were also communal offerings if the community accidentally worshipped avodah zarah, didn't realize it was avodah zarah, b'shgaga. Sha'avdu, and then also it got lost. V'frish acharim tachtehem, there's also a sin offering. Kulam yamutu, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Now this is something called a chatat meta. There's 5 cases where you have a korban chatat. Like let's say if I brought my own sin offering and it got lost, and then I brought a different animal in its stead, that's called a chatat shenitkapchu ba'aleha. I already received atonement, and now we have the animal. I find the old animal. That animal has to be left to die. Specifically, it's a law for the chatat, has to be left to die. So Rabbi Yehuda says, same thing, not just for the individual chatats. Okay, there's 4 other cases, but not just the individual, also it would hold true for the community. But not everybody agrees with that. His opinion isn't important for our purposes. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, notice who's here, Rabbi Shimon. What does he say? Now, this is exactly what we're looking for. What do you do with the sin offering that can no longer be used because it was lost and we used a different one? right? What are you expecting? What did we say before? Because of this gzera, we don't allow you to just bring it on the altar for burnt offerings. You have to wait till it gets a blemish. You have to redeem it and then take the money and buy voluntary offerings. Well, that's exactly what it says. Yiru ad sheyistavu. You leave it to graze until it gets a blemish. V'yimachlu, and you sell it. V'yiplu d'mehem l'nidava, and then the money you get from the sale, you go to buy animals and use them for burnt offerings on the altar. She'en chatat tzibor meta. Now he says, the chatot that are metot, we said before, that's only individual offerings. We don't do that with tzibor, with communal offerings. Now, that's not, again, that's just a side point. But the main point, they say, Amai, why do you have to wait till it gets blemished? Nikruvu inu gufayu olah, right? Shouldn't you just be able to use them as burnt offerings directly? Which they said, obviously, the fact that Rabbi Shimon doesn't allow for this is because it must be because of the tzera that we talked about. You don't want to switch the designation of a sin offering to a burnt offering, even in a case where it would be allowed, because you might do it in a case where it's not allowed, which would be at the earlier stage before you received atonement for that. Amarav. Second source, Afana Nami Tanina. We can also see this. Now here we're talking about a case where let's say the seir was lost. Okay, if you remember, we take 2 goats on Yom Kippur, we do the goral, we have a lottery, one goes La Hashem, one goes La Azazel. The one that goes La Hashem is our seir and asabifnim that we've been talking about. What if you lose the seir La Azazel or something happens to it or gets disqualified? Now, at that point, you need to bring a new one, but you can't just bring one because the seir has to go through a lottery. To go through a lottery, you need 2. So you take 2. You might remember this again. I think I made all these pictures of what happens in one and this one. Anyway, you take both seirim now. You take 2 new ones. But the problem is you still have the seir Lashem you designated before, so you're going to end up with an extra one. This is a different case where you have 2 seirim. Okay, the other one was you lost one, right? In this case, you're going to end up with 2 seirim that were designated by the lottery to go inside. So obviously you don't bring both of them. So what do you do with the second one? You use one of them. Hasheni yireh ad sheyisteh. So the second one is left to graze until it gets a blemish, v'yimachir, and it will be sold v'yiplu damav l'nidava. And then what do? You take and then buy voluntary offerings with it. Again, same thing. Amai yikrav iu gufeola. Why don't you just say, let's bring it as a voluntary offering, that animal itself? Why wait till it gets blemished? And alav shmamina, it must be. You can infer from here, gzera achar kapara atu lifnei kapara. It's the same gzera we talked about. Obviously, you can't just switch a chata to an ol, even though theoretically you could, but we're not going to allow it because you might think you could do it, even in a case before, right? When you just had one seir for God, you didn't bring the sacrifice yet. Maybe you think, oh, I could swap this animal and just use it as a voluntary offering, which obviously you can't. Amar Ravina, af ana nami tanina. Third proof. Now we're moving out of the realm of communal offerings, going into individual guilt offering. So I'm supposed to bring a guilt offering, and then either I die or I got atonement with a different animal, okay, because I lost it, like our example before. What do we do? So according to Tanakama, same thing. Wait till it gets blemished, then take the money and buy, and it goes to the temple for these communal voluntary offerings. We're going to have 3 opinions here. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yamut. Rabbi Eliezer says it's left to die like the chatat, and that's because there's a pasuk that says kachatat ka'asham. Chatat and asham are the same. The question is, to what extent are they the same? So there's obviously a deliberation here. Rabbi Elazar says, well, since in the chatat it would have to be left to die, the asham is just like the chatat. Obviously, the other 2 opinions don't agree with that. Rabbi Yoshua, the third position is yavi b'damav ola. Sounds like the first, because you bring a korban ola with the money. Okay, so with the money means wait till it gets a blemish, redeem it, take the money, go buy new offerings. But the difference is, the Tanakama says, they go l'nidava, that's for the temple, for the communal voluntary offerings. What Rabbi Yeshua says is, this is your offering, or mine, let's say. This is my offering. So I take the money and I bring my own individual voluntary offering on the altar, not the kites mizbech. I just bring my own personal voluntary offering. Okay. Point is, whether you take the first position or the third position, both of them say that what do? You have to let it get blemished, take the money, and go buy something else. The likra pagufa ola, you know where they're going already. Why don't you just sacrifice it directly as an ola? Well, it must be that it's a gzera that we don't allow it now, even though theoretically we would, because we don't want you to do it in an earlier stage. Okay, so 3 proofs from tannaitic sources for what Rabbi Yochanan said, how we understand Rabbi Shimon's position. That again, what do we do with what we were really trying to explain? What do we do with all the extra offering, all the extra animals at the end of the year? The ones that were Ola offerings for the Korban Tamid that we bought too many, we just take them indirectly. Ola, Kayetzim is back. The second part was the one we brought proofs for is if, though, you had an extra sin offering because something got lost somewhere right there, you don't designate multiple ones, but you just had an extra one. So what do? You end up you have to wait till it gets blemished, only then redeem it, sell it, take the money, go buy new offerings, and put them in the Kaitzim Mizbeach. Now we're going to have a braita for the fact that what we said earlier about what do you do with the korbanot olah, right? So the extra ones, for the korban tamid. Tanya namihachi, here's a braita to support that. This proves what we just said before. According to Rabbi Shimon, what do we do if you don't have lei beitim manalehem? What do you do with the animals? Oh, they go to this kayetz hamizbeach. Because remember, what did the rabbis say? I just want to keep reminding you so we have everything straight. The rabbis say you just redeem them, right? You do a kind of, I'd say a little fictitious kind of thing, because in the end, you're going to just bring those sacrifices next year too, according to the rabbis, for the Korban Tamid. But in order to do that, you redeem them, you take, right? You buy them with money, right? You basically move the sanctity onto money, and then that removes the sanctity. Then you take the new money from this year, right? And that money, by the way, would go to Nidavar or something for the altar. You can buy sacrifices with that money. That doesn't interest us. The point is, you now take the money from the new year, you repurchase those animals, and now you can use them for the Korban Tamid. Now, Rabbi Shimon says you can't do that because you can't redeem them when they're unblemished. You can only redeem them once they're blemished. Obviously, once they're blemished, you can't use them on the altar anymore. So, according to Rabbi Shimon, what you do is, in this case, you can't use them for Korban Tamid for next year. That's not going to work because you can't redeem them while they're unblemished. While they're unblemished. So what do? Oh, you can just use them for different burnt offerings, for these voluntary offerings. Because what's the issue? The tmidim have to be bought with this year's money. That's the whole issue. The ola doesn't have to, a voluntary offering can be bought from any money. It doesn't make a difference if it's last year's money. So that's what we do with them according to Rabbi Shimon. Okay, so now this says exactly that, which is Rabbi Shimon's position. What do you bring with the extra animals? So let's explain these words. We're now at the top of Amud Bet. You bring these sort of dessert offerings like these benot shuach, which were these very fancy types of figs, to the altar. It's like bringing these really nice figs on the altar, like dessert for your meal. So the Gemara asks a side question. How could you bring these beautiful figs on the altar? Haktiv ki kol se'or v'chol dvash. You can't bring any kind of delicacy type thing. You can't even bring leavened bread on the altar. You can't bring honey on the altar. That's like a sweet. So you're not allowed to do something that's, everything has to be very simple, basics. How could you be bringing desserts on the altar? To which, of course, Tani Rabbi Chanina brings a braita that says, Kibenot shuach la'adam. They're just making an analogy here. They're saying these sacrifices on the altar are like desserts for people. It's not like we're bringing desserts on the altar. They don't think that. Okay, moving on. Still on this topic, though, we said we take that money that we sold the blemished animals and we buy, right, if you have like a chatat, a sin offering that you can't just sacrifice on the altar, we let it get a blemish, we take the money, right, we transfer it to money, we take the money and we buy animals with it. For what? Burnt offerings. Now, burnt offerings can also be from a bird, okay? If you look in the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, it talks about if you want to bring an ola, a voluntary offering, you can bring it from the animals, you can also bring it from birds, and then it gives all the rules if it's from a bird, if it's from an animal. But comes Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda, not to be confused with Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak in a second we're going to get to. Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda says, you can't buy animals for this extra, when you want to bring extra sacrifices, which by the way, it doesn't even have to be if you redeemed an animal, just in general, we don't bring sacrifices on the altar, right? All these extra money we have, you don't buy birds with them. You don't bring these voluntary bird offerings. Even though such a thing exists, you don't bring them. Amarava haborcha. Rava said, it's ridiculous. You made this up? Like, where'd you get this from? Silly. Of course you could bring an animal, a bird. Amar le Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Rava, my borchata. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says to Rava, why do you think this is ridiculous? And we made this in the, again, this is Rav Nachman bar Rav Yitzchak, who's supporting Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda. Don't be confused, it's not the same person. He says to Rava, why do you think this is a mistake? Ana Amarita Niale. I told him this. And Mishmeit Rav Shimi Minahardia Amarita Niale. In other words, I have a tradition. He had a tradition. He heard it from me. I heard it from Rav Shimi from Nahardia. To Amar Rav Shimi Minahardia, as he said, Motarot, the extra stuff, Linidvat Tzibor Azle. They go for communal burnt offerings. Ve'ein olat of b'tzibor. There is no communal burnt offering with a bird. Okay, all the communal burnt offerings, like the korban tamid, are done with the lamb, right? The kvasim, and any burnt offering there is that's an ola is always an animal offering. There is no such thing. Now, what I said in the beginning of Vayikra, that's if an individual wants to bring an offering, the individual can bring a burnt offering from a bird. But there is no such thing as a communal offering bought from a bird, and therefore these are communal offerings. You can't buy it with buy birds with it. Okay, obviously the birds are less, right? Less, so it's more expensive to buy the animals and nicer to buy the animals. So that's why I use the money for the animals, not the birds. Okay, so there's a big question. I'm just going to raise this. I'm not going to go into it, but you can read some commentaries on it if you want. Why Rabbi thought this was a borcha, why he was so against it, and particularly because there seems to be a Mishnah that shows the rabbi's position for sure matches what Rav Shimi says. So some people think it's because there's a machloket about it, and kind of like he said, is if there was no machloket, it's a bit of a debate here because it was an explicit Mishnah. So if it's an explicit Mishnah, the rabbi's position in that Mishnah, okay, it's a little bit weird that Rava says, where'd you make this up from? It's pretty clear what Rava didn't know the Mishnah, so I'll just put that out there as a question. But now we're going to move back to Rabbi Yochanan, okay, and we're going to go back to the beginning. Af Shmuel tzara lahad Rabbi Yochanan. Shmuel also said, like Rabbi Yochanan, that what did Rabbi Yochanan say? Remember in Yud, Yud Abubet, Tmidim shelo tzorchu l'tzibor nifdim tmimim, right? You can redeem them tmimim. And then what did he say though? That's not according to Rabbi Shimon. According to Rabbi Shimon, you actually just take them instead of, right, you're not going to use them as tmidim anymore. According to the rabbis, use them as tmidim, you just redeem them and buy them back. According to Rabbi Shimon, you use them for kayetz hamizbeach. Right? You just take those animals and redesignate them for a different sacrifice. So now they're going to say the fact that Rabbi Yochanan understood this from Rabbi Shimon, also Shmuel said this. Af Shmuel several had Rabbi Yochanan, so Shmuel also held this way. To Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Rabbi Yehuda said the name of Shmuel, Korbanot Tzibor Sakin Moshachtan Lemashahin. What does that mean? The knife designates them to what they are. Okay, what does that mean? So Rashi explains, Sakin Moshachtan Lemashahin. Sakina shochatan stam. If you take a sacrifice, you have an animal that you designated for a particular purpose, then you slaughter it without saying, I'm slaughtering this for the purpose of this sacrifice. That's moshachtan the korban shufrash mitchila lekach. Now, the sakin can bring it to be used for whatever korban it was designated in the first place. But here's the key: afilu ein ze uto korban atzmo. Meaning, if originally you designated for an ola, let's say for the korban tamid, and then when you slaughter it, you don't say, I'm bringing this for the korban tamid. So the sakin slaughters it, the knife slaughters it, and that kind of makes it designated as an ola, whatever you originally designated for, but not necessarily the ola that you separated it for, that you designated it for. So even if it's not the exact same korban, and that's what it says, ukigon ola tamid, ola lekayit, imein over oila tamid. So if we can't use this anymore for the tamid because that was from last year's money, and you slaughter it without saying what you're slaughtering it for, it's automatically slaughtered as an ola, and in this case, it'll have to be for a voluntary communal ola offering. Okay, that's exactly what we said that Rabbi Yochanan explained in Shmuel. That's what we see. I'm sorry, Rabbi Shimon. What Rabbi Yochanan explained according to Rabbi Shimon, that's exactly what Shmuel says. And right, so that's korbanot tzibor sakim moshachtan lemashahin. So remember, it can't switch a chatat for an ola, but it can switch an ola for a different ola. Tanya nami hachi, here's a braita to support this also. Umodeh Rabbi Shimon b'seil. He agrees about the goat offering, right? All those sin offerings. Shim lo karev beregel yikra b'rosh chodesh. Shim lo karev b'rosh chodesh yikra b'yom kippurim. Right? This is exactly what we said before. That if You didn't use it for Rosh Chodesh, you can use it, right? In this case, you didn't use it for the holiday, you can use it for Rosh Chodesh. If you didn't use it on Rosh Chodesh, you could use it for Yom Kippur. Im lo kareh b'Yom Kippurim. If you didn't use it for Yom Kippur, we're talking about the one done outside, not the one done inside. You'll see why in a minute. Yikra b'regel. V'im lo kara b'regel, say yikra b'regel achir. You didn't do it on this holiday, you could wait till the next holiday. Shemitchilato ba ele lechaper al mizbeach hachitzo. As long as it was coming to be atoned on the outer altar. In other words, the details of these sacrifices are the same, basically. They're all sin offerings. They're all sin offerings that are done on the outer altar. Basically, they can be interchangeable. And that's Rabbi Shimon, right? That's Rabbi Shimon we saw in our Mishnah, and that's what Rabbi Yochanan explained according to Rabbi Shimon. As long as it's the same title, chatat, you can use one for the other. Okay? Okay, that's the end of that whole section. Now we're moving on back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah in the next section talked about what does the Seir Hanasa B'fnim do. Now we already learned the Seir Hanasa B'fnim atones for shkagot, right? You made a mistake about Tumat Mikdash B'Kodashav. You ate right when you were impure, or you ate sacrificial items, or you went into the temple. Which type of shkaga? If you knew about it in the beginning that you were impure, you forgot, and in the meantime you still haven't figured out. Because remember, once you figure out, you're going to have to bring your own individual offering, but the communal offering of the goat that's done inside the goat sin offering, that covers this. However, that was in the first part of the Mishnah when it talked about all the different Tumat Mikdash V'Kodashav and what atones for what. And all the shkagot, and which one, Yediyah this, Yediyah, which one, okay? Then the Mishnah later, and you probably don't remember this because we learned, we learned all the Mishnahs of the parak. At the time, toward the end, toward the end of the first parak of Mishnayot, it said, in addition to that, al zidon tumat mikdash v'kodashav seir nasa b'fnim b'yom kippurim v'chaplim. The seir that's done inside and the day of Yom Kippur also atone for intentional sins, all intentional sins that you did, having to do with eating sacrificial meat when you're impure or going into the temple. You knew you were impure. You went into the temple impure on purpose. Okay? You knew it was forbidden. Also, the one that's done b'fnim atones for that. Okay, now we're going to have to say, where do we get that from? Benani Mile. What's the source? The Tanu Rabbanan. Again, we're back to our pasuk about the Seir Nasa b'fnim, which we've read a bunch of times. The Chiper ala Kodesh mitumot b'nei Yisrael. You have to read the rest. Umi pishehem, and for their sins. L'chol chatatam, for all their chataot. Okay, so let's explain. Right? Psha'im and chatim were both sins. So what do we darshan? Psha'im elu hamaradim. Psha'im, to be a poshe, is someone who intentionally sins. A mored is someone who rebels. That's someone who intentionally sins. V'cheinu omer, here are two proofs. Melech Moab pashabi, the king of Moab went against me. This is from Sefer Melachim. V'omer az tifshal livna be'etahi. Okay, these are two psukim where pesha means someone intentionally went against, rebelled. Chataot elu hashkagot. Now, a chatat is a shkaga. How do we know the root chet? Now, obviously, chet could also mean intentional, but the root chet is often associated with shkaga, and that's how we know, because it says, if you sin unwittingly, and the word used there is chet. So from there you see, the psha'im are the chata'im, the intentional ones, and the chata'im are the unintentional. And that's how you get that the one done inside atones for both. Now we go back to the next topic. The next topic in the Mishnah, we go back to the Mishnah. The next topic in the Mishnah, I'll read it again, is what does the Seir Lazazel atone for? The one that goes off the cliff, what does that atone for? So let's read the line. Al shal averot shebetorah, on all other sins in the Torah, not Tumat Mikdash v'Kodashav that we've dealt with until now. Kalot v'chamurot, severe, right, less severe, more severe. Hazdonot v'ashkagot, intentional, unintentional. Hoda v'lo hoda, which right now I'll explain as you know about it or you didn't know about it, which kind of sounds the same as zdonot and shkagot, right? Intentional, unintentional. Aseh v'lo taseh, kritot u'mitot beitin. Okay, whether they're positive or negative commandments, or ones that have karet associated with them, or mitot beitin. Now, also, there's another repetitive thing in this line, which is aseh and lo taseh are usually the less severe ones, and the kritot and the mitot beitin are the more severe ones. So why does it say everything twice? That's what the Gemara is going to say. Hainu kalot, hainu aseh v'lo taseh, chamurot, hainu kritot u'mitot beitin. Okay, number one, that all is the same thing, right? The light ones are the positive and negative, and the severe ones are the ones that have karet or death by the court. Hoda, hainu mezid. Hoda means you knew about it. That's intentional. Lo hoda hainu shogeg. So why does it say everything twice? I'm a Rabbi Yehuda Hachi Kamar. Rabbi Yehuda says you should read the Mishnah like this. Al shar averot shebetorah, on all other sins in the Torah, bein kalot, bein chamurot, whether they're lenient, whether they're severe, bein sha'asa'am b'shogeg, bein sha'asa'am b'mezid. Okay, and we're going to go have right 2 tracks, light ones, heavy ones. Within each track, whether you did them intentional or unwitting, and within unwitting, otan sha'asa'am b'shogeg, bein nodalos fekan, bein lo nodalos fekan. Hoda v'lo hoda is not what we thought you knew and you did it anyway. No, it's if you were unwitting about it, and whether you figured out that you did the sin, or maybe you didn't yet figure out that you did the sin, which is what we talked about in Tumat Mikdash V'Kodeshav. Now we're talking about it in every other sin. Okay. Now, and then why did they then go back to the kriton and the mitabit and the ase and lo tase? Well, they want you to know Eluhena kalot. What is kal and what is chamor? Let's define it for you. What is kal? Ase v'lo tase. Eluhena chamorot kriton and mitabit. And then it just defines what is kala, what is chamor. Okay? And that's how we read this line. Last thing for today, we're just going to start with a question. Hi, aseh hechidami. When it says a mitzvah aseh, the Shiur Mishaleach atones for, that you did, how does this go about? Right? What kind of situation? And we're going to assume either you transgressed some mitzvah, and then you repented, or you transgressed and you didn't repent. Well, either which way, it's not going to make sense here. Because idelo about tshuva, if you didn't repent, how on earth is the sacrifice going to atone for you? Zevach Rishayim toeva, you're a rasha. And God despises the korbanot of Rishayim. It's a pasuk. So, of course, God wouldn't accept this korban to atone for a sin of someone who's an evil person who hasn't repented. And ida avid shuva, if you did shuva, what, you have to wait till Yom Kippur to get atonement? That makes no sense. And kol yom anami, you could do it any day of the year. The day I did atonement, I will get the day I repented, I will get atonement, as it says in a braita, detanya. Avar mitzvah taseh v'asat tshuva lo zaz misham ad shemochalin lo. If you went against, transgressed a mitzvah taseh, and then you did tshuva, basically you don't have to leave there until you get immediate pardoning. You're done. You're clear. So what is the Seir Lazazel going to do then? Okay, so we're stuck with this question. Very interesting question. You have to wait to get an answer until tomorrow. So quick review of our daf. We started with Rabbi Yochanan saying that basically from yesterday's daf, that there's a machloket Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis about what you do, right? Whether the tmidim, could you redeem them tmimim or not redeem them tmimim? Where do we see the rabbi's position on this? Rabbi Shimon, we saw, but where do we see the rabbi's position? What tannaitic source? In the end, there is no tannaitic source, and it's just a tradition that Rabbi Yochanan has, but we tried 3 sources. The 3 we saw yesterday, none of them worked. Or each one at least was potentially rejected. If Rabbi Shimon doesn't hold levitim analehem, right, which is why you can't redeem them to mimim, so then what does he do with these extra animals? And we said he puts them straight on the altar for the kites and mizbeach. He moves the ola to an ola, but you can't move a chata to an ola. So you have an extra chata, you can't do that because of this gzerah. We're worried you might switch it earlier when you're not allowed to. 3 proofs for that. Abai, Rav, and Ravina all brought proofs for that. Then we had another support for the fact that according to Rabbi Shimon, you can bring you bring these extra ones for kites and mizbeach. Then we had this, but not olat ha'of, even though Rava said, I don't know why, you can't use, these kites and mizbeach can't be olat ha'of. Had a debate about that. Then we said that Shmuel also holds that according to, right, like Rabbi Yochanan said, that according to Rabbi Shimon, you bring these l'kates hamizbeach, and you can just switch, ola to ola, or chatat to chatat. Okay, we have Shmuel say the same thing. And then we went back to the Mishnah and went to, where do we know that the Siyar Nasa B'fnim atones also for, not just for the shkaga of you knew about it, forgot, and still haven't figured it out, also for any intentional sin about tuma in the temple or with sacrificial items. We saw the source for that, the Pishehem. And then we got to this last part about the Shar Ve'Rocha B'Torah and that whole line, which seemed to be repetitive. How do we explain that line? And then, right, that was the Seir Lazazel. And then we want to understand what's the mitzvah aseh, because it doesn't make any sense. Why are we waiting for Yom Kippur if you repented? And if you didn't repent, well, then you can't bring a korban and think that that's going to atone for you. So we'll end with that interesting question, and we'll pick up from here tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good day, b'sorot tovot, and may the rest of the hostages be released speedily.